it is, and they really talk about the top 100. There's probably like 10 to 12 players, but it goes beyond that. I mean, if you look at like the 100 to 150 range, there's still another like 8-ish guys who either have top traits or have played good enough football with like okay traits that you're like interested. There's even some guys like later in the draft that I think could go like 6th, 7th round that I'm a little higher on that are intriguing players that have had inconsistent production at times, but then testing wildly inconsistent that we can talk about too. It's a wild corner class. It's going to be a lot of pick and choose later on, but there will be starters found late in this draft.
Yep. All right. Cool. So we've been used to having some pretty good corner play at the top of the draft the past few years. I mean, we've had Sauce Gardner, we've had Derek Stingley Jr. The year before that, we had um, J.C. Horn, we had Patrick Surtain II. So I'm curious to see what you think. We've talked a little bit. We've recorded our Christian Gonzalez breakdown. That should be live later today. So you should be able to see that pretty soon. So I'm curious to see how you think that these guys stack up to them. But considering we have a little bit shorter of a show today, we're only going to be going till about 11 a.m. Eastern. Let's jump right into it. So beginning with the corners, what do you want to start with?
Yeah, so we tier these off like I do with every other position, most of the positions we've done so far, but some of the positions we've done that haven't really been super tiered, like linebackers was kind of all in the same boat. There is like a clear tiering here in the top 10, and so 3 down starting level corners. I think there are 2 guys specifically in this draft that stand out to me, and that's Devon Witherspoon and Christian Gonzalez, who a lot of people have 1-2 interchangeably. I have Witherspoon 1 over Gonzalez. It's very close. I think they're both very good players, and they do different things specifically depending on what you're looking for in your defense, right? So we'll talk about Witherspoon first to have him as the number 1 guy. A little bit smaller. There are going to be people that don't want to draft Witherspoon 6 feet tall, and it's kind of silly because he's like 5'11" and 5'8" or whatever, which is like really completely nitpicking. But that there are teams that have like a 6 foot limit on the corners they draft, and because of that, he probably won't be as high on some teams' boards. But outside of that, his style of play is about as aggressive and like energetic as I've seen from a corner. Period. In any draft, this is a guy that plays a lot of off man, but can get up in your grill and play press as well. Really, a man corner first. I think he's capable of playing zone. I think he'll test well when he does for the pro day at Illinois, but we didn't really see it at the combine. So at this point, Gonzalez, who I think a lot of people will think is a better athlete and probably is, kind of has the edge there. But Witherspoon is rare in his ability to get involved in the run game, his ability to blitz off the edge as like a nickel corner. And I think you're going to see him be able to rotate kind of inside outside a lot like some of these like top corners we've seen go, like a Jalen Ramsey. He can start off as a nickel in his first couple of years in the NFL and end up being like an outside guy that matches up in man pretty consistently.
And would you say that, you would assume that if that's the case, then he can move inside if the number 1 threat is a guy that opposing offenses like to put in the slot, helps, mitigate matchup problems. Not every team likes to do that, but if you can, it makes it.
Yeah. And I think you kind of saw this at the Rams a couple of years back with Cooper Kupp. And of course, he was really good this past season. Cooper Kupp is a really good receiver, but he lines up in the slot like 90% of the time. And that matchup has been extremely beneficial for the Rams because like the best slot corner he went up against maybe all year was probably Byron Murphy in Arizona. So, when that's, the skill set that you're dealing with as a defense, you don't have that type of player that can match up. Of course, Cooper Kupp was going to have like an amazing year. And this is the type of player that kind of is a counter to that movement in the NFL where you see these better receivers like Justin Jefferson, even this past season, move into the slot. Witherspoon's going to be able to follow you wherever you go.
Right. All right. So then with Christian Gonzalez, what are the key differences here? Why is he your number 2?
He's probably a little more scheme versatile. I don't know that he's definitely not as good of a man player, but in terms of different types of zone coverages and playing like trail man underneath in zone, he looks very comfortable doing that. We talked about kind of some of the things I'm a little bit concerned with where I don't think he's like super involved in tackling. He can get a little handsy sometimes at the catch point, but he has like the length, the break on the ball, the hip fluidity is excellent. Kind of the smarts in zone, like his own instincts are excellent. And of course, he's the guy who tested the best out of these players and has like great size, like 6'1", closer to 6'1.5". He's going to be about 200 pounds. He has like the build and the tools that if you want to turn him into some, like mold a guy into something that you have a vision for, he's the guy you want in this draft.
Yeah, so this guy I am a little bit more familiar with after watching him in preparation to do our breakdown, and he's an extremely fluid athlete. He's very comfortable in transition. I mean, when the ball is coming, he has no fear. He's able to just locate the ball and go bat it down. Um, in terms of his man coverage, like I I don't think I saw him play press man as much. Um, so that he can mirror, but I didn't see him get really up and like punching in the chest a lot. So he may do that, but I would say that it's intermingled sparsely throughout his game. Do you feel like that's something that he's going to have no issue with?
Yeah, I think he can transition to playing more man for sure. It's just, I think it's going to be. I think Witherspoon's projection to playing zone is quicker than Gonzalez's projection to man, just because Gonzalez didn't do a whole lot of that press stuff in college. And Witherspoon, having played off man a lot and getting used to that, I think that's a quicker translation to zone.
All right. Sounds good. So who makes up your next tier then?
All right, so tier 2 is guys that you kind of are looking at to be your by year 2, like cornerback 3 types, or if you're really needing guys, these guys could probably be your number 2 as well. And they have like inside and outside flex, like they can play both slot and on the outside. They have positional versatility. Not that you want these guys specifically to play, slot, but if you needed them to, they probably could. And there's 4 of them. Again, this is where the depth of draft is. These are the guys that probably go from pick 16 onwards, right? And Joey Porter for me does end up being corner 3. I wasn't as high on him as a lot of people seem to be. I don't think he's like a top 12 player, but I do think he's a good player. But he's joined in this list in order with Emmanuel Forbes, Deontay Banks, and Cam Smith. So let's talk about Porter first. A guy that I think at the beginning of the year, a lot of people talk about his ball skills, and I think he does have very good ball skills, but specifically, I think his closing speed and length are impressive, because this is a guy with, I believe, close to 34-inch arms. It might even have 34-inch arms, which is just absurd for a cornerback. You never see that. 6'2.5", 193 pounds. Like, he is built impressively for a guy who tested as well as he did. I believe he ran a nice 40 time, has the press hands. Doesn't look as good, again, in zone coverage. His lateral quickness is a little bit of an issue, but this is, again, another guy that I think in man coverage you feel very comfortable with. Not nearly as scheme versatile as the guys at the top of the draft, but he's battle-tested, played multiple years at Penn State, played against good offenses, and played well against better opponents like Ohio State. So he is kind of the beginning of this next year, guys that could step in and start on the outside year 1, right? And you'd be okay with it. Next on this list is going to be Emmanuel Forbes. For me, is actually my corner 4. And I had to go back and forth between him and Deontay Banks, because I think they're both really good players with interesting tools. But for me, Forbes, again, like competitiveness, I really look for at the cornerback position. I think it's one that you kind of need to have short-term memory loss when you get beat, even if you take it personally, and you need to go back and start firing off against your one-on-one opponent again and again. And he definitely has it. This guy, again, is 163 pounds and is kind of lengthy, so he looks like a complete stick, and people kind of point this out in the draft, but he ran a crazy 40 time. I believe it was like a low 4.3s. I think his hip fluidity is really good, and I think a course that's kind of helped by the way he's built. Really natural ball skills, smooth mover. He's really up again. I can get in your grill early in press coverage and man coverage. I worry a little bit about him like feeling in zone coverage and kind of keeping his balance downfield when he's trying to keep his eyes on the quarterback and who he's defending against. And of course, that frame is like something that we're kind of have to keep an eye on, see if that holds up against the physicality of the NFL. This is a guy that I think, if he hits the ground running year 1, could be really impactful just because of the ball skills he showcased at Mississippi State. And I wouldn't be surprised if he even starts out in the slot, just because he kind of has that type of build.
I mean, aren't you worried at all about his frame? 166 pounds is very small. I mean, he's got some height and length, but like that's stick thin. I mean, like,
Yeah, I mean, I would be more worried about it, I think, if everybody else was, which is kind of a silly thing to say, I guess, but it's like, if he adds weight, which I don't think he'd have trouble with, he can put on 10 more pounds, he's probably going to lose a little bit of that fluidity, but I do think it's like unique fluidity for this draft. I think you could even say it's he has maybe outside of Gonzalez, like the best fluidity. And I just think that the way he doesn't have trouble tackling. He's really like pretty good form tackler for a corner. We've talked about that before in the show, how that's like often a problem for these guys. And he's like a smart player. watch this guy and I think, okay, you made it, multiple years in the SEC and played really high level ball, and I don't think it's going to be that big of a jump for him to the NFL. Yeah, he might have some injuries, but corner is actually the most injured position in the NFL year by year. So in my opinion, like it's hard to like pick out guys because of size and say like I'm worried about it because there's not really a correlation between that and injuries. Like they all get hurt because they're smaller in general. They're dealing with this. So I think if you've held up in the SEC, like you're gonna be able to make it in the NFL. And I think the upside of what he possesses in terms of those ball skills and the ability to track, to create turnovers, quite frankly, is different in this draft. And that's, I think, early we want to like aim for that type of thing because the turnovers ultimately are like what can turn a bad defense into really. Dallas a couple years back had like one of the greatest EPA defenses in the NFL, and they were, I think, 26th in yards against, but it was because they were like plus 16 in the turnover margin, right?
Yes, that's true. I'd be a little worried about it just because, they were just talking about this on Prospects of Pros. It's a fascinating episode. They talked about all of the tests that you can do on a player to find out what their lean muscle mass is and what it is that you can, how much you can project a player to add weight. What kind of weight will it be? Will it be positive weight? Or is their frame going to hold up to it effectively? So I'm sure that some of the testing for that stuff is involved here with a guy like this. But, you'd have to be pretty confident that he can put on weight comfortably. At least in my opinion, to want to take him particularly highly, because at 166, you're gonna have to make tackles. You know what I mean? And if you are a guy that's just gonna be easily muscled by players like a Drake London, like like a whoever, right? Like, is it gonna be a mismatch between you and Alan Lazard just because he's that much bigger than you? You know what I mean? These are questions that I don't know the answer to. You know what I mean? If they're going to try and run the ball at you, are you going to be able to tackle a 215-pound running back, 220-pound running back effectively?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the answer to all of that is yes, but I would be a little bit nervous about it. And so I think it's hard to. I mean, I understand coverage traits, but I also, I wonder about that. You kind of expressed that you don't think it's a big deal already.
Yeah, I
so
mean, I
I'll
think
let you
he
go over it
behind
again.
Witherspoon has like the most willingness to go up and hit people in this draft. Like I think he is like a really sound tackler on film in the SEC. Like I recognize there's a jump even from the SEC to the NFL, but I think again like willingness to tackle is more than half the battle.
All right. So, and then it's Deontay Banks from Maryland. So, what do you think about Banks?
Yes, I really like Banks, and it was tough having him all the way down here at corner 5 because I think again this is a guy that I'd probably like think about day one. Just really is I mean, he was one of the best testers in the draft. Maryland just had crazy speed on the outside, at corner and receiver at the combine. Really good peel off in terms of like peeling off of his job, his responsibility in coverage and like helping when the ball goes somewhere else. Has really great scheme versatility. They ran all sorts of different stuff at Maryland. Jacorian Bennett, who goes later in this draft, is a much more raw prospect. Similarly, will be more ready for whatever defense he fits into. I think in terms of like quick burst, run support, maybe his catch point, like ability to kind of gets there early sometimes. Like there are some things you could fine tune with his game for sure. But he has tools in terms of that speed, and kind of his size is good enough. And you see like great flashes on tape of his ability to kind of run down and have closing speed on guys downfield. That I just think he might also, again, another guy that might be a slot year one, but your projection for him to end up being a long-term outside corner, whether you're a defense that's looking for man or zone coverage, he's going to be able to develop into either for you, in my opinion.
Okay, and then if you're looking at the final player, Cam Smith, it's interesting that you have him kind of lumped into this group here because this is one of the guys where some people have expressed that he's close. Some people have expressed that he's like a significant, like a clear tier below this group of guys.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your? I know you have a little bit higher of an opinion. So what is it about him that you like more than many other people?
Yeah, so Owen and I had him as cornerback one to start the year, and the corner class at the beginning of the year looked way different than I thought it was going to be. It was kind of Smith and Eli Ricks, and who's still going to go like relatively high in this draft, although he didn't play a whole lot. He was kind of in the doghouse at Alabama, and one other guy whose name like eludes me at the time.
Keely Ringo.
Keely Ringo, right, was a part of the discussion. We'll talk about him in a little bit. Right. Yeah. People liked Keely Ringo. He probably was the consensus top corner. For Owen and I, Cam Smith was the top corner at the time. And I think his year this year was not as good as last season. I think, I couldn't tell you exactly why because I didn't watch all of South Carolina's games, but I did watch, about 3 or 4 of his games and kind of dived in. And you just didn't quite see like the dog in him as much as you did like the year before. He was a guy who was like really, really competitive and kind of like a theme with a lot of these guys that I have at the top, like willing to go up and hit you, like willing to get into a guy's grill and push him around and, redirect routes and, at the catch point, like kind of get physical. And, there's a play we talked about back in August, how he chases down 250-pound DJ Uunglele, who's at full speed and just like knocks him over, like standing up. Just, that's rare, I think, for a guy who is, quite frankly, he's under 80 pounds. He's not a huge cornerback, right? He really does have slot and outside versatility. Like this is one of these guys who I think outside of just him and Witherspoon, like actually consistently played inside and outside in college. He's a fluid player. But the thin frame, the drive on the ball at times, his timing again is something that I think needs to work a little bit better. And I think there were some more problems with footwork this season. I think they got a little more complex in the coverage shells that South Carolina ran, and he was getting used to that. So that's going to be a thing that continues in the NFL. It's going to get more complex, and he's going to have to work on those things. But I think, when he has an understanding of what he's doing better, his style of play is something that works in the NFL. Because of that, I'm a fan of Cam Smith, and I don't think he's going to go in the first round. I think he's probably going to find his way, call it like mid-day 2 or middle of the second round. But whoever takes him, I will be a fan of because I think he's as good as any corner in this kind of group of cornerbacks. I think the people that are lower on him, I theorize probably just watched this past season, and that's it.
Yeah, that definitely could be the case. So I'm curious about some of these other guys that have fallen off the top where they were earlier. Keely Ringo's a guy where I think some people still view him pretty highly due just to some traits. So I don't want to jump straight to him, but I'm curious to talk about him. So what is your next tier made up of?
Yeah, so the next tier is guys that are, again, like kind of your third corners, but I think they lack inside-outside flex, and Keely Ringo is at the top, but he will be my cornerback 7. And Owen and I kind of have been on this. He's actually maybe the player that we've talked about the most this season is Keely Ringo, and just texting each other, interestingly enough, because neither of us really were ever a fan of his game. Clearly a very good athlete, like big, like 6'2", 210 pounds, like big cornerback. But our friend Dom C over at the Green Bean podcast, the Jets, kind of thinks he might be a safety. And I don't disagree with that. I think he might be a safety. He's an extremely raw corner who kind of shows like he's aggressive to the ball. He has great closing speed, strong upper body. Guy can like make tackles downfield, but like the things he's good at are what safeties are good at, I don't see him like making the play early in the snap count, right? Like getting in a guy's grill, redirecting the route, making plays within 5 yards of line of scrimmage, showing amazing transition feet to stay with guys, feet and hips sinking. I think really like he is an athlete, kind of like, again, we keep bringing this up on the podcast that I don't think is fully developed as an athlete yet. So he hasn't been able to learn how to play the position he's playing yet. His feet and hips are often unsynced. And so I think you draft this guy as a defensive back and you see where he fits in. That's kind of why I think his best landing spot will be a place like New England, where they just kind of like love to just develop defensive backs and see what position skill set you fit into. But for me, Ringo, like he reminds me a little bit of Andrew Booth last year, who I also kind of thought was more of a guy who could play safety at some point. He didn't play because he had all these injuries. Ringo doesn't quite have those injuries, so he's probably going to go a little bit higher. But it was also like a really, really raw super athlete at corner who was a great recruit at a high school and had these amazing like ball skill flashes at Clemson, but it just did not hold up down after down, on his game film. And I think Ringo is kind of in that boat where it's a lot of projection right now.
Yeah, I think, I've watched very little of him, but he's a guy who, doesn't necessarily feel the most comfortable running down the field when the ball is in the air, depending on the situation that he's in. Something interesting about him too is that, again, measurables are what they are, right? They're They're not the ultimate. They're not the end all be all, but you can see some interesting comparisons, right? So he's a big guy at like 6'2", around 6'10", ran a 4.36 at the combine, but only jumped 33 and a half in the vertical, right? Like a lot of these really athletic, explosive corners, we're expecting to see them jump closer to 40 inches. Maybe they don't clear 40 because that's very explosive, but that is fairly significant difference in the broad jump 10 and a half, which is, 10 feet 2 inches, excuse me. So, what do you think about the disparity between the speed and then the vert and the explosiveness?
It's interesting because the vert and the explosiveness kind of plays more into that fluidity that we talked about with previous guys.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the speed is kind of like if you have build up time, like you can take Daniel Jones for example. Like all these people are like always a couple years back were like, oh, he's faster than Lamar Jackson. Look at his top speed. It's like, yeah, if you run 70 yards, your top speed is going to be, I could run 70 yards and I could put up a number that looks pretty good, but it's not going to be like actually what my fast speed is because my acceleration is going to take, 60 yards to get to that point. So what's impressive is that a guy like Lamar Jackson can get to that speed in 10 yards, which he does. I think Keely Ringo, is a guy that has impressive top speed, but doesn't quite get there in 10 yards, he's probably needs a little more buildup. And that's kind of, he's more of a rangy player than he is a short-term explosive player, which generally, again, pushes you more into the safety box, in my opinion, than it does corner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny because you see all the time, somebody likes to throw out this stat. Oh, he hit 21 miles per hour in the GPS, and it's like they always like to say it with a guy that you're not expecting it, and it's like if you're not expecting that, then it's probably not something that's going to come into play very often in the actual game of football. Because, if you're not obviously bursty, then you're probably not going to have a lot of opportunity to get up to 21 miles per hour, even if you can. So it's just, I think it's something that people like to throw out that isn't necessarily, that big of a deal. But yeah, so I agree. I was just kind of interested because, we see it from time to time, guys that have that. I mean, look, I will say this. To run a sub 4.40, you still have to be fairly explosive, right? We're not talking about him as if he is the same athlete as Daniel Jones. To make that clear, but I do know what you mean. But there is disparity in terms of this testing that you can project into, beyond just a number and what that actually looks like on the field. All right, so who do you want to touch on next year?
Yeah, so let's go to Clark Phillips, who's number 8, and is still in this tier of like guys who I think are inside, outside only. Ringo's kind of outside only, right? So Phillips, to me, is a slot corner to the next level. I think he's going to stick there, and that's where he's going to be because he's 5'9", 184 pounds. Like, he's not a big guy. He has really good explosiveness and speed on tape. Ran a 4.51 at the combine. People got concerned about that. I think the problem with that is he actually ran like a 1.5, 1.10 split, which is one of the better 10 splits, or is in the realm of like better 10 splits amongst corners. Like, it looks good. Smaller guys, shorter legs, tend to be more bursty than they are long speed types, right? You get up to your top speed, and then it's hard to like continue to extend that top speed. So I'm not really concerned about that for him. I think there's clearly like a lack of willingness to get involved in tackling and things like that on his tape, get involved in block shedding, because he's just, quite frankly, like, not built for it. Doesn't have the length to shed. It doesn't have, the size to overpower guys. But in coverage, he has impressive ability to close and transition with speed. He made some really nice ball skill plays on the sideline in zone coverage as an outside corner this past year. But I think ultimately this is a guy that plays as your slot corner. And I think, I want to see what this guy can do a little bit with the ball in his hands. He didn't do a whole lot of extra stuff at Utah, but I think he could be an interesting like punt returner and gadget type, kind of like we saw with Marcus Jones last year, going from Houston to the Patriots. And I think Clark Phillips is this type of player. And I think you need to get creative with how you use him because he has, and for his like size, impressive traits. And I don't want to like get this confused because it's like, if you're 5'9" and you can run, you have burst, like, it is hard to bring guys like that down sometimes. So he had like multiple, big plays after interceptions returning the ball because he just is like a unique build for a guy with those type of athletic traits. And so it's he's a guy that I think his projection is really fascinating in what direction it'll go. I think it needs to be a team that is looking specifically for a nickel, but he could be very, very beneficial to whatever team gets him because of his rare skill set. There's not a lot of nickels specifically that are going to go in the second round these days, and I think he almost assuredly will.
Do you have anyone that I'm just throwing this at you right now, but do you have anyone that you would comp him to in the NFL right now?
I mean, I don't want to say Marcus Jones because I think the guy's like really like a little bit different in terms of his ability to make plays with the ball in his hands. But I think Phillips is a better cover player than him. Um, man, what would you comp Clark Phillips to? It's tough. He really is kind of unique. Like it's difficult to give him a comp because I think he is going to tell us a lot about the direction of the NFL, whether he succeeds or not.
Yeah, it'll also tell us a little bit about the direction where he actually ends up going.
Yeah.
Because this is a guy where there's probably going to be a fair amount of variety and opinion on what the draft value for a player like he is. Because you look at nickel guys, and that if you're smaller, a lot of times teams are looking for you to have very explosive athletic traits because you're working in a smaller space. So you need to be able to, get everything happens faster, right? So you need to be able to close on the ball a little bit faster. You might not be running down the field. You might not be asked to, engage in contested catch situations very often, but they want to make sure that you're shutting down that area. And he doesn't necessarily have that either. And again, we talk about testing sometimes, and sometimes it's not as translatable, but with a 4.51 40, you know what I mean, and a 10-yard split of 10.51. I mean, 10-yard split of 1.51. There is question of exactly how fast he is, right? So if you're putting him in the slot, then can he shut it down there? And maybe the answer is yes, but it's going to take, I think, a couple of teams to believe in him as a player and not necessarily just the package. But we'll see. I mean, where do you expect him to go in this draft?
I think he's probably going to see his name called like the end of round 2. Probably a team that needs more depth, like the Bengals or the Eagles, are just looking for specifically like this type of third corner who can play a nickel. Like, if you're willing to spend capital because other positions are like set, you take this guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. So it's interesting that you say the Bengals because Lance Zierlein has his comp as Mike Hilton.
Okay.
I'm not necessarily sure, if you agree with that, but it is a team that might be looking for the similar type of player, but a little bit younger, a little bit cheaper. So, all right, who do you want to talk about next year?
All right, so the next two guys are very similar. Julius Brents would be my number 9. Tyreek Stevenson would be my number 10, and they're both also in this range of guys I kind of think are projecting to being outside corners eventually. Lengthy, faster, athletic guys who just didn't really put together all on tape yet. Again, but I think they're more naturally corners than maybe a Keely Ringo, but not as good at athletes yet. Brents, I think we really saw him stand out at the Senior Bowl. He had a really good combine. There are games on his tape that are really, really good, and there are games that are not as good. So I feel a little more confident that he can find what's going on in those games that's going well for him, that he can become the corner you want him to than a guy like Stevenson. I also think Brent's like unique length and size kind of puts him a little bit ahead. We've seen guys like Benjamin St-Juste, who I'm very excited for in Washington, who's kind of similar, who was kind of in like this mold of like a 6'4", 200-pound corner with extremely long arms, who played some man and zone at Minnesota. Didn't have the best like consistent tape, really had a great Senior Bowl, just had to kind of work on his fluidity and not like pushing guys around so much. He was getting called for penalties, and eventually just became, because he tested well enough, this guy that just is a very difficult piece to match up with when you're going up against him as the offense. And Brent's kind of is uniquely built that way as well, in that he is like literally a 6'3", 200-pound corner with 34-inch arms, like we talked about with Joey Porter Jr. Differences with Joey Porter Jr. is like he's not a guy who's consistently going to like shoving you around at the ball, whereas I think Brent's, probably has that build and strength to do that.
Okay. And then what about Tyreek Stevenson?
Yeah, so he's also like, again, bigger 200-pound corner, not as long. He's only 6 feet, but he did run a 4.45 for a guy at 200 pounds at corner. Like that's usually somewhat impressive. That's around what Pat Surtain was at. He has more flashes on tape that you're kind of like, wow, that is like unique athleticism translating to football at Miami. But again, it's not something that's so consistent on his film that you're like, I'm not as high on him as some people are. I think some people have had Stevenson going in the first round because people look for specifically like ball skills in a lot of cases that come from athleticism, and I think honestly ball skills more stem from intelligence and like anticipation in the NFL than they do that. But Stevenson kind of is able to make some plays on the ball that others can't, uniquely because of just his athleticism, as he's still trying to figure out how to play the position.
Yeah, it makes sense. I haven't really taken a close look at these guys, so I think any commentary on them would probably be a little bit too vague, and we don't have a ton of time, so I think we should talk about safeties here. I
You
know
want to
that
talk
you
about
probably
safeties?
don't have.
All right.
What's that?
Yeah, we can do safeties for sure. I got to pull them up.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I think the thing is at this point we're far enough in the draft process that we should close out, talk about safeties and get that done, because then all of our prospect rankings and kind of previews for them are for all players are done. We've done linebackers, we've done every other position. We can focus in on some conversations about draft value, about where is a wise place to take a player, where are they available, and then we can talk about some more mock drafts and some more speculation, because once you get deep enough into it you can, and then we can return to conversations about different players as well once I've gotten a chance to watch a few more of them as we continue our breakdowns. Because sometimes somebody just pops to me that I just wasn't necessarily expecting, and I get eager to have a conversation about them. So, I mean, based on the fact that you've mocked him in the first round and not had any other safeties mocked in the first round up to this point, I'm going to assume that your first guy is going to be Brian Branch from Alabama. So,
Yeah,
if you want to jump in on him.
First tier is just the guy. There's two guys I think are starting safeties in year two at this level, and Brian Branch is one of them. Antonio Johnson is the other. I don't think he's going to go in the first round, but I would take him relatively high in this draft. I might even like if Washington took him at 16, I wouldn't be like, this is dumb. Like I think he's like that good of a player, and he's kind of again a guy who slipped because I think like his first two seasons in college were really really good, and this past season he was just good, and that's it. Branch though really put it together all this year. I mean, he is an absolute thumper and has the speed to kind of put behind that. He is a really unique build for a guy that I think is really good at playing in the box. He's only not even 6 feet tall. He's 190 pounds, and he has like relatively good zone instincts to go along with like being able to move at that size in coverage. So when you ask this guy to like blitz, he's the guy that quite frankly, doesn't just try to like avoid the running back to keep the quarterback. He runs right through the running back, which normally you see more from 200-pound safeties, 210-pound safeties. So he is just a very, very interesting, I hate this term Swiss Army knife because like that, I feel like it's overused, but he really is about as versatile of a safety prospect as I've seen at the top of this draft. Jamal Adams didn't quite fit into that bill. He's not a guy you really wanted playing like slot that often or playing deep that often, but was a really good box impact player. Whereas I think Branch, because of his size and measurables and what he's shown at times, like peeling off of certain routes and in coverage and, kind of anticipating where he needs to be, his ability to kind of just, close on guys with range, added with that just willingness to go and hit people in the box and anticipate, tackling and blitzing. He is got a high floor in all three levels of the game, whether that be deep, middle of the field, or in the backfield. And I don't know that he's going to be like a Hall of Fame type player, but I think he's probably a multiple Pro Bowl type player, and in the right scheme, like he really gives your defense a boost.
Yeah, consistent ball skills definitely give him, a fairly high floor, because anytime that you can make a play on the ball, even if you're not picking it off, if you're going to be able to force incompletions on a regular basis, then that's a really big deal for a safety. And then everything else that you can do around the line of scrimmage, and TFLs or stops or stuffs or whatever the case is, those are all really nice to have. But if you can make plays consistently down the field, whether it's picks or not, that's a really big deal. And I think that's a big time trait that he has, and a reason that I'd be comfortable with him going fairly high. And I think it's tough for me, just like tight end, for me, I think my bar is a little bit higher for what I'm willing to do in early round one. I need to see some really unique things to want to spend the pick there. But there are guys who would warrant it, right? I think Minka Fitzpatrick is definitely a player like that. You just need to be sure that he can bring something to the table that's really unique, that he can really make a difference in all that space.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally of the view that the value of the safety position has been undervalued for years, and I think the reason you don't see these guys go higher in the draft is because they just don't get paid a whole lot. I think if the market were more like, quite frankly, the linebacker market we've talked about is like distorted because edge players get paid as linebackers. Safeties should be paid more than linebackers. They're a more important position than linebackers are, but because of that, I think they tend to wait on guys in the draft because it just doesn't. You don't want to spend all that money on a first round player when you can like go out and pay guys $10 million in free agency and get like a really quality player, because that's not a lot of money for a guy that does impact your coverage unit as a whole.
Right. Well, I think that's just it. The value of players is always more clearly identified in where the top of the market players are available once they reach their second contract. Are they regularly available in trades? Are they available in free agency? Or do you have to have drafted them to have a realistic shot of having one of those players on a second contract on your team? And so the NFL basically, they tell us what they think about these players. They tell us what they think. And when you got guys like, yeah, they might have the franchise tag used on them once, but when you've got guys like Marcus Williams available going in free agency, when you've got guys like Juan Thornhill, when you've got, I'm just thinking about guys who've gotten paid in free agency. There's a lot of them. I mean, when I did this rundown last year, I want to say like 6 of the top 10 paid safeties were available in free agency or something crazy like that. So it's like that's why you don't have to draft one in the first round, because unless he is a unique game changer, then you can just get one. And then you can have to focus this asset, which you can't, you only have one of most of the time, on a player that you can't get in free agency. You know what I mean? Where you can't get a top tier corner in free agency most of the time. So I think that's really what it is. It's not about, is he a valuable player? Is he a good player or useful player? It's
a unique market.
Exactly. It's just about, opportunity cost, really.
Yep.
All right. Yep. Who do you want to talk about here next?
Yeah. So Antonio Johnson, who,
all right,
there was a chance he was a top 10 player for me in the preseason. He's a 6'2", 200-pound slot corner for like the beginning of his college career. And we were like, oh, well, is he going to, over Boomer Bust, we're like, is he going to play real safety or is he going to play corner? And this year he did play safety, and he was good there as well. He has unique matchup length. The guy is a really, really solid tackler in terms of form and just ability to use his size to bring guys down. Like, this is your tight end matchup piece that I feel very comfortable like lining up, and he will do a good job because he has the athleticism to do so. Maybe not the best like long speed rangy guy, which is why I probably wouldn't put him in single high looks as much. But that versatility, ability to play in the slot and also play deep is something that a lot of people ask questions about with safeties coming out. And I think Branch is a guy that you probably find out whether he's better deep or playing nickel, and he stays there. Johnson, I want moving back and forth. Now, the problem with that is Texas A&M never did that with him. They played him either all slot corner one year or then all deep safety one year. And so I kind of want to see if he's capable of doing both for whatever team he gets to in the NFL. I think he will be. But we talk about the growth of like guys like Kyle Hamilton in the NFL who can play the nickel position and match up with these kind of weird, unique, different types of bodies as skill players and also get involved in the run game. And Johnson fully fits into the move that the NFL is heading towards.
Okay. All right. So remind me what his measurables are real quick.
He is 6'2", 198. We can talk about his combine measurables in a second here when I pull them up really quickly. Sorry, this is great podcasting. He ran a 4.52, so Branch ran like a 4.51. So they're like similar speeds. I think Branch's 10 split was a lot better. But again, he is a guy that I think has the ability. Like he's, if he was not as good of an athlete, he could have added weight and played linebacker, right? But I think because he is as fluid as he is, he's playing safety. And I think, he's probably a poor man's Kyle Hamilton, who I do think kind of got underwhelmingly covered this year by the media in terms of how good he was in Baltimore.
Right. Well, I think, in terms of measurables, as far as, testing numbers like 40 or 10 split or explosiveness or vert jump or broad jump, for safety, it's not as important
Yeah, no,
because,
it's not.
Look, speed's great, but, the key thing is you are starting in space. And so if you're reacting, it doesn't really matter how fast you are. You're probably already lost. Like, you
Mhm.
have to have instincts. You have to have an understanding. You got to know where you need to be before it happens. And so, that's my opinion. That's one of the reasons that Kyle Hamilton's testing never was that big of a deal to begin with, right? You know what I mean? It's more about, the size that he had that would allow him to match up in unique coverage situations and the instincts that he had and his ability to get where he needed to go. In advance. And so same thing with Antonio Johnson here. So if you're confident that he is a player who knows exactly where he needs to be at all times, he has the anticipation to get there and the instinct to close and finish, then that's what you need out of the safety position. If you could say that there was a singular trait that really stands out to you that makes him special, what do you think that would be?
I didn't even talk about his ball skills. I think he has really good ball skills too. And I think it's just the use of his length, leveraging opposing slot and tight end type pass catchers. And then, also at the catch point using his length as well. I think he's like, he knows that's his weapon and he uses it very well. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
it's to the extent where if he can kind of make plays, even if he's not right on you, he doesn't have to be the most physical player because he just has this ability to make up range with that length.
All right. So if you're willing to put these guys in the first round, then who falls just behind them?
All right, so yeah, these are more day two guys, and they're going to be like your number three safeties, probably pretty immediately. Guys who you probably have a role for on certain downs, might be more in dime, but it could be nickel. And there's a few of these guys that fit into this group. It's more Chris Smith, Sidney Brown, and Jordan Battle. And I actually have Jordan Battle as the third best safety on my board. Battle is a guy that I had as a first round pick last year. I was a big fan of him, and he is a dude who loves to come up and hit people. And really, again, as an Alabama player, he was a captain, I believe. I might be wrong about that, but him and Brian Branch were like an unbelievable tandem these past couple seasons. He has the range and ball skills and deep zone feel that's impressive for a guy his size who can, come up and just, again, he whacks dudes. He's 6'1", 210, big safety. He's not a man cover player. He can be kind of physical at the catch point to a point where I think he might get flagged a little bit. And I'm not certain exactly where he fits into coverage yet because he could be a 2-eye guy and he could be a nickel player. And it was kind of weird because him and Branch were switching spots all the time. They're playing with three safeties on the field with DeMarco Helms. But I think, again, this is a guy that if you have two safeties you feel good about and you bring him in as your third, he is just an interesting matchup piece that, again, because of that physicality, he can cover tight ends and then adds a different element in the box when you have him lined up in nickel.
All right. And since we're getting a little short on time here, why don't you roll right into the other two guys as well?
Yep. And Sidney Brown, again, similar player, maybe not as good of a competition level at the Big Ten with Illinois, but again, 5'10", 211, big dude who can hit, physical, matches up with tight ends, kind of has this linebacker type build and burst. He looks like a linebacker when you watch him, but he really is a safety and has catch point athleticism and this ability to kind of make plays with range. But I think his zone instincts need some work. And, again, another guy that I think is probably definitely a nickel at the next level, but probably line up at linebacker more than you would expect in college. But he's a unique athlete for his size. And I think his projection will be interesting because he played high school ball in Canada. So a lot of those guys generally have more development than the American players.
Interesting. Why do you say they have more development?
Because Canadian high school ball is just not as good. We're getting more and more players coming from Canada to the U.S. and like Benjamin St. Juste is another guy like we just mentioned before who was from Montreal and has done a lot to build the sport up there. But there's a lot of guys in this draft. Matthew Bergeron, another guy who's Canadian, who's going to be. He even talked to me about this. You can go check my Twitter. I have that interview somewhere. Canada has more and more players getting better, but the talent level is still kind of not great. So the guys who make it generally need to play college in the U.S. because it helps them play against better competition and start learning the game a little bit better from better coaching. Quite frankly, it's just a sport that's only starting to really start growing at the high school level in Canada. So, and a lot of the coaches because of that are generally somewhat from the United States. And if you really want to make that jump, you need to come to the U.S. so you can make it to the NFL. It's not against Canada. They're doing a really good job. Obviously, they're starting to really. They've had like 7-8 guys drafted each of the past few years, and they might have more this season. But and some of those players are really, really good. Jalan Holland is another guy who's Chuba Hubbard's another dude as well who have made it to the NFL, have played good ball. And Sidney Brown and his brother Chase are kind of the next group of that. They definitely have shown kind of their raw athleticism translating to football early in their college careers and late now. And I think going to the NFL, they're impressive developmental players who could have big roles someday.
Yeah, Brown is really interesting in terms of his makeup. I mean, he's only 5'10", but he's 211 pounds, and he ran a sub 4.5 40 and cleared 40 in the vert jump as well. Yep. So he is a compact, very solid, explosive player. So I think the upside for him is very, very high.
In his best games, he makes like tons of big, his best games, he impacted the game more than the other player on the field. Like I'm talking about like multiple turnovers, multiple sacks, like just all over the place. That was very inconsistent.
All right. Well, I'm curious to see where he ends up. All right. So final player, Chris Smith. What would you like to say about Smith?
Yeah, so he just didn't test as well as I was hoping it would. And he's kind of, again, an undersized guy who I don't really know where he fits in yet. He's probably a deep safety, but I think in terms of his like aggressiveness and willingness to hit guys, play the ball, and kind of plays like a veteran because he's a fifth-year senior. He's been in that Georgia defense for a long time, was kind of a leader there. He like understands what he needs to do. He's just a very smart player. I think he steps into an NFL defense, and he either is – a guy who helps dudes develop and has like an interesting role on the team, but will also probably be like a pretty good special teams player and like an important part of that rotation and getting guys onto the roster. And, this is kind of a guy that if you take him, like I think Washington might be interested in this type of player because they love like guys who are veterans already, who are ready to play professional football, like understand what the grind is like and are just, good locker room dudes. And Chris Smith is that. Plus, I think if you can look past all of the kind of physical things that have happened in terms of his combine and senior role over the past couple months, I think his tape at Georgia was very good against like good competition. And he's not as much of like your flashy like turnover force or like great player, but he just like does what he's supposed to and like fits into a role really well as a responsible player on the field.
Yeah, looks like he likes to hit too.
Yes.
Which is always like it's something that in the past you're like. As soon as you see it, you're like, that's a plus. Nowadays, you're like, it's a little bit risky. Yes, he's an enforcer, but is this, is he going to be able to manage that play style in the NFL? Because it's flagged a lot, right? So you have to walk this delicate balance of, being physical and forceful, and still operating within whatever the rules the NFL deems this particular season. So, I'm curious to see where he ends up going as well. I mean, do you have a rough projection for him?
I think he's going to end up going early day 3. Like I would probably take him in the 3rd round, but I don't think he's going to go that high.
All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us today. Nick, appreciate you doing this. All right, I can't wait to get a closer look at some of these guys because we're kind of in the midst of our cornerback breakdowns right now. And so we'll be getting back to those soon. Again, keep an eye out for Christian Gonzalez. He'll be dropping here fairly shortly on the channel. You can check him out. And you can find me on Twitter at TheMaxine. You can find Nick at Nick with Sports. You can find Defiant Takes Football at Defiant Takes on all social media outlets. You can find all of our written work published at defianttakesfootball.com. And of course, we're live every Monday and Thursday. But I will say there is a chance that we might be flexing our schedule a little bit here to flow with potential life changes. So we might just change the hour in which we go live. We'll see. Just want to let y'all know about that potentially. But all right. Cool. Let's shout out Noah Ashley, our producer at No Ashtray Sports, for just being awesome in general. And then that's going to do it for us today. We'll see you this Monday.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.